Hello, and welcome to Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series. Today, EEI International Programs is excited to welcome Oded Galor, Professor of Economics at Brown University. He joins us to discuss his book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. He will be joined in conversation by our host, EEI Senior Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones.
Welcome again. Thank you, Professor Galor, for joining us for this Influential Minds conversation.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this show.
Well, let me just start by, congratulating you on a book that came out actually a few years ago. I bought it about 2 years ago, and as I was reading it, became clear that I wanted to have a conversation with you. As we always do on this Influential Mind series, we like to bring to our audience, thought leaders from around the world whose perspective oftentimes are not brought to the energy sector because of perhaps the distance one might seem. But as I read the book, I actually saw a lot of interest in the book that I think our audience will find interesting. So the book, again, it's called, as you can see, of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Wealth and inequality, these are all big topics in the world today. And so we're going to have a very rich conversation here today with Professor Galor. Let's begin by just asking you, Professor, just tell us, why did you write this book?
Well, so the book reflects my research agenda in the past 3 decades. And this research agenda, to a large extent, was motivated by my quest for a better understanding of the roots of inequality across the globe, and consequently the attempt to design policies down the road that could mitigate these inequalities. And to a large extent, my exploration showed me that a significant portion of the inequality as we see it across the globe today is originated in forces that operated in the distant past. Forces that operated hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. And the suggestion based on this book is that, in fact, if we would like to design policies that will mitigate inequality across the globe, they will have to be policies that are country-specific, geography-specific, and history-specific. And this was, as I said, the prime motivation behind my book, the design of policies that could mitigate inequality and the exploration of the roots of this inequality as we see it today.
Well, we're going to get into those topics. Obviously, one of the most intriguing things I think is your emphasis on growth and understanding how we sort of disentangle growth as we see it. And in the world today, the big discussion is about growth. So we hear a lot about growth and the role of growth as well as stagnation. But before we get into all those deep technical conversations, tell us about your squirrel. Because in the beginning of the book, you talk about this squirrel that you saw running around in your garden, I guess, and it sort of inspired you to think about this. What is the linkage between the squirrel and us humans?
Right. So over most of human existence, as suggested by Hobbes, human life was nasty, brutish, and short. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living conditions were very close to the subsistence level, and there were minor differences in living standards across time and across space. And then suddenly, in the past 200 years, the world is experiencing this incredible metamorphosis, a 14-fold increase in the standard of living as measured by income per capita. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and an incredible divergence took place in the wealth of nations across the globe. So in this respect, the analogy of the scroll is very important. Think about the scroll. The life of the scroll has and is still nasty, brutish, and short, in the sense that the scroll is preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living conditions are very close to the subsistence, and there are no differences in living conditions between the scroll that live in the United States and that lives in India. And in this respect, this was the motivation for my analysis. How do we explain the fact that we managed to emerge from this poverty trap that characterized most of human existence, where other species across the globe are still trapped in this sustained poverty trap.
Yeah, interesting, Professor Galor, you also seem to spend a lot of time in the book emphasizing the importance of growth. And, growth and stagnation, like I said, those are two terms that are really shaping the world today. We're having this conversation here in February, where the world is going through a lot of crisis. So what's your fascination about growth? Why is growth so important?
Right. So perhaps I should take a step a little back and just state the scope of the book. So to a large extent, the journey of humanity, my book, explored the evolution of human society since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And it attempts to resolve two of the most fundamental mysteries that surround this journey. The mystery of growth, namely the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after hundreds of thousands of years of near stagnation, and the mystery of inequality, namely why some countries are rich and others are poor, what is the origin of this vast inequality in living standards across the globe, and why in the past 200 years we see this divergence in the wealth of nations. So the obsession, if you wish, about the mystery of growth and the growth process is partly based on the fact that it is this transformation in the growth process that occurred in the past 200 years that triggered much of the inequality across the globe. Namely, at the moment that societies move from stagnation to growth, since this transition was associated on average with a 14-fold increase in income per capita, those societies that managed to take off earlier than others magnified their living standards relative to other societies, and much of the inequality as we see today has emerged. Namely, if we want to understand the inequality as we see it today, we have to understand the roots of the transition from stagnation to growth, the roots of the growth process.
Interesting. So talking about stagnation, one of the individuals in the book who perhaps have been sort of mentioned a lot in other concepts or constructs is the 18th century cleric, Thomas Malthus. In fact, his famous theory about stagnation and growth is well known around the world. So tell the audience about Malthusian trap. What is this idea that he came up with, and was he right or was he wrong?
Right. So over 99.9% of human existence, societies are residing in what one may define as a Malthusian trap, in a poverty trap. So this is a time period in which technological progress is taking place. It is not as rapid as we see today, but nevertheless, technological progress takes place. But unlike today's world, it is converted into more people rather than into more prosperous people. So this is a time period in which if people are adopting a better plow, naturally they have higher yield than otherwise. But this yield permits them to sustain more of their children. More of their children will survive, more children will be born, and after a few generations, this surplus will be divided over a larger population, and resource per person or income per capita will revert back to the previous equilibrium position. So during the Malthusian epoch, what we observe is certain interesting dualism. On the one hand, stagnation in income per capita. Living standards are not changing in the long run. But on the other hand, we see dynamism in the context of technology, in the context of population, and in the context of human adaptation. And it is this dynamism that ultimately permits humanity to take off from stagnation to growth. So when you think about the writing of Malthus and the ideas of Malthus, they're quite accurate. They're quite accurate description of the world till the time of Malthus. Namely, they were very good characterization of the world over 99.9% of human existence. But precisely at the time that Malthus is writing is the period in which the world is starting to change, and we see this enormous takeoff from this Malthusian trap, from this poverty trap into the sustained growth regime. So ironically, it is precisely the time period in which Malthus is writing that the world in which he wrote about has changed quite dramatically.
As I was reading the book, I was wondering, what would he say if he were here today? Because he would probably have a whole different concept in terms of stagnation and growth. But let's talk about, some of the undercurrents that have occurred that have led to this change. Can we just discuss a few of the things that were happening behind the scenes, as you talk about in the book, that all of a sudden led to this transition?
Right. So this transition is very dramatic, as I said. So over 300,000 year period, societies are in near stagnation. And then suddenly in the past 200 years, we see this 14-fold increase in income per capita. So what is behind it? So as I said before, humanity as a whole is originated in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. This is the emergence of Homo sapiens. And at the time when Homo sapiens is emerging, technological progress is rather rudimentary. Technologies are in the form of stone tools that are one stone tool is replacing another stone tool. And when stone tools are advanced, they, as I said before, permit more people to be supported, and consequently resources per person are not expanding, although resources are expanding. So what we see over this time period is when technology is advancing, more people can be supported. More people implies more potential innovators and therefore faster rate of technological progress. Faster rate of technological progress support more people. So in the course of human history, we see what I defined as the wheels of change that are rotating at an ever-increasing pace. Technological progress supports larger population and more adaptable population, and more adaptable population and greater population supports faster technological progress. But despite this rotation of the wheels of change at an ever-increasing pace, the standard of living remains unchanged. Technological progress increases, population increases proportionately, and as a result of it, there is no change in the standard of living. But ultimately, after 300,000 year period, we are moving from stone tool technologies that existed in Africa 300,000 years ago to steam engine technologies. We move from a population that was about 2.5 million people in the eve of the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago to about 1 billion people in the midst of industrialization, a 400-fold increase. And we reach a stage in which the technological environment in which people are operating is changing very, very rapidly. Mm-hmm. This is the time period in which parents realize that in order to benefit their children, in order to prepare their children into a rapidly changing technological environment, they must start to invest in the education of their children. We see the emergence of massive public education, say in England in the 19th century, and ultimately this investment in education is coming on the account of the number of children that can be sustained. This is a time period in the eve of this change that parents have very limited resources. In order to invest in the education of their children, they have to economize on an item in their budget constraint. They cannot economize on their own consumption, and as a result of it, they're forced to economize on the number of children. At the moment that fertility starts to decline in the so-called demographic transition, the growth process is freed from the counterbalancing effect of population, and we reach a stage in which technological progress is converted into more prosperous people rather than into more people. So this Malthusian link that existed over most of human history, in which technological progress is generating a proportionate increase in the size of the population, is no longer in place. The demographic transition, the decline in fertility, permits the growth process to be converted into the material well-being of the population rather than into more people as existed before. So this dramatic change that is taking place is precisely what I define as a phase transition, a time period in which technological progress is so rapid that it demands human capital. Investment in human capital is not free lunch. It comes on the account of fertility. Fertility rates drops, and consequently, technological progress, education, and lower fertility are all propelling the growth process and moving the world into the modern growth regime.
It's interesting. I want to come back and talk specifically about your unified growth theory, but let's stay on the issue of population. We now have heard the world population has hit 1 billion. We're seeing a declining population or predicted declining population in China. We're seeing a stagnation of population growth in Japan. And then we're seeing an explosion of population growth in Africa for the most part, right? So how do you expect population to play a role going forward as the world develops in terms of growth and other types of economic measures?
So two observations, and that's very important for the resolution of the mystery of inequality. So as I suggested before, this takeoff from stagnation to growth is not occurring at the same time period across the globe. Some societies are taking off earlier than others. And this is partly based on the fact that the return to education or technological acceleration is not occurring at the same rate across the globe, and consequently, the demographic transition, the decline in fertility, is not occurring at the same time period across the globe. Those societies that are experiencing the demographic transition towards the end of the 19th century are taking off and are magnifying their prosperity in the past 150 years. Other societies are lagging behind. So it's very critical to understand that these demographic forces and differential demographic forces are critical for the understanding of inequality across the globe. And to a large extent, if we think about contemporary policies of, say, of the World Bank, they are certainly advocating towards family planning and fertility control with the good understanding that, in fact, family planning and fertility control can boost prosperity across the globe. So yes, Africa is still having fertility rates that are relatively high, okay, but they're significantly smaller than the one that existed towards the end of the 19th century or even 4 or 5 decades ago. So total fertility rate in Africa is about 6 to 7 towards the end of the 19th century, and it declines gradually at the moment to about half of it. And as you said, if we think about total fertility rates in other regions of the world, in many regions of the world, total fertility rate is below 2, below replacement level, and the population is projected to decline in the coming years. So the question is, what are the implications of these demographic changes for the future trajectory of the world? And actually, when we think about the absolute decline in the size of the Chinese population at the moment, the Chinese are very worried about the consequences of this decline for their well-being because they're concerned about the increase in the dependency ratio, the increase in the relative size of the non-working population, and consequently the decline in productivity. But part of the insights of unified growth theory, part of the insights from my book, The Journey of Humanity, is that in fact, this concern is overblown in the sense that in this transition, as fertility declines, societies can invest more in the well-being of each individual, in the education of each individual, in the health of each individual, and consequently, the current generation can potentially be much more productive than the older generation. And although the relative size of each generation may decline over time, the productivity of this generation will be significantly higher due to the fact that the quality of this cohort, or the education of this cohort, or the human capital of this cohort will more than compensate for the decline in population growth. So the insight here is that we have to think about it more holistically. Population is important, but it's not about population per se is quality adjusted population. So the population will gradually decline, but the quality adjusted size of the population may increase over time, and consequently the decline in world population is not necessarily implying that productivity will decline and we will see a decline in the wealth of nations.
So basically, just to sort of sum up here, population is one of those key drivers that has been at the sort of at the bedrock of industrialization. So in terms of growth, Professor Galor, you talk a little bit about your unified growth theory. Why? And there's been a lot of unified theories in other areas of science and physics and elsewhere. Why did you feel the need to develop this theory as we look at growth?
Right. So unified growth theory is an attempt to understand the process of development in its entirety. So rather than developing different theories from different periods of development, this is an attempt to develop a single theory that will capture the process of development in its entirety. Now, the development of this theory was predicated under the assumption that much of the inequality, as we see today, was originated in forces that operated in the distant past. And therefore, a theory that cannot link economic development today to initial conditions that existed hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago, will not be in a good position to explain the inequality that we see today. If you think about, say, modern growth theory that was developed in the past 4 or 5 decades before unified growth theory, much of it was based on what we defined as the modern growth regime. But many societies first are not in the modern growth regime. And as I suggested before, much of the inequality, as we see it across the globe today, was originated due to the differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth. And therefore, unless you have a unified theory of economic development, unless you link the present to the past, you will not be in a position to understand the roots of inequality, and you will not be in a position to address via policy this inequality as we see it across the globe.
So as we look at growth then, both in the sort of a historical context and in the present modern day context, would you then say that given the population of the world at 8 billion, that the current analytical models that are used to talk about growth, maybe we've heard the discussions around, say, GDP, for example, is not a perfect metric for talking about growth. Do you think we need to start reconsidering how we define sustainable growth or what growth is in general?
I think that, again, I mean, when we think about measure of economic prosperity, measure of well-being, and measure of growth in human prosperity, one can debate whether the measures that we have are appropriate, whether they measure prosperity in an appropriate way. And many question the validity of income per capita as a good measure to capture human development and human prosperity. It is quite apparent that if you enlarge these measures, if you take other type of indicators, human development indicators, the measures are quite correlated. They're not perfectly correlated, but they're quite correlated. And therefore, if we focus on income per capita, we will have a very good idea about how societies evolve over time, what is the origin, if you wish, of much of the inequality as we see it across the globe, regardless of how we measure inequality. And consequently, it is positioned us well to design policies to mitigate inequality. So the measures are not perfect, but they are correlated, they can be expanded, and the insights will not change dramatically about the sources of inequality as we see it today.
Well, for those just joining us, having a conversation here with Professor Oded Galor with the Brown University. He's the author of the book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Professor, let's move on now to talking a little bit about wealth and inequality. But I want to begin that transition by talking about electricity. You're here at the Edison Electric Institute having a conversation with us about growth and development. So just talk a little bit about the role that electricity played in driving growth and development around the world.
Right. So broadly speaking, the growth process naturally cannot occur without the use of energy in general. And part of the ingenuity of humanity in the process of development was in the development of technologies that could ultimately lead us to the extraction of different sources of energies, or the development of different sources of energy that permitted us to have the growth and the prosperity that we see at the moment. And one of them, naturally, is electricity. So the introduction of electricity, and in particular network electricity, was a significant force that occurred in the course of human history and permitted several major advantages that were not present before. So unlike other sources of energy that were present before, they permitted an efficient location of plants and factories based on the distribution of the population, based on the feasibility of this location from an economic viewpoint or otherwise. And they did not necessarily require the establishment of a plant near a water source or near a place that can support other type of energy sources. So energy was very important in sort of in the spatial location of industries and ultimately in the development of societies in a way that was much more efficient. But of course, later on, it led into additional benefits in the course of education, in the course of health provision, and in the course of mitigation of inequality across the globe. So naturally, energy is very important, and electricity was in particular very fundamental in permitting the prosperity that we see across the globe today.
Yeah, and I thought it was kind of interesting, having read a lot about Industrial Revolution. You actually said it was neither the age of steam, neither the age of cotton, nor the age of iron. Instead, you call it the age of progress.
Indeed.
Why?
Indeed. So from time to time, when people think about the transition from stagnation to growth, they view industrialization per se, in the sense the machinery, as the cause of the transition from stagnation to growth. But part of the insights of the journey of humanity and part of the insights of unified growth theory is what permitted the transition from stagnation to growth is not industrialization per se, but the acceleration in the changes in the technological environment. And it is this acceleration and changes in the technological environment that permitted or required investment in human capital, lower fertility rates, and ultimately the transition from stagnation to growth. So the period of the Industrial Revolution is a period of change. It's the age of progress in many different dimensions, not necessarily in the simple context of industrial technologies. In fact, if you think about industrial technology per se, and if you think about it in the context of the United States today, it is quite apparent that those regions of the US that were industrialized first are lagging behind in terms of economic prosperity today. These are the regions that we define these days as the Rust Belt. And this is true in England, this is true in Germany, and this is true in France. So the main lesson of the journey of humanity for less developed societies is that in order to propel economic growth, you don't need to invest, or you don't want to invest in low-skill industrial technologies. You want to invest in technologies that are very intensive in human capital, very intensive in education, because in the end, these technological spillovers into the realm of education is what will permit societies to propel its economic prosperity over time. There is nothing unique about the industrial technology itself. It is, as I said, the progress and the change that occur over this time has permitted the transition from stagnation to growth. And this is one fundamental lesson in the context of less developed societies. don't necessarily feel that you need to go through all the phases of development that the most developed societies in the world has passed in the past, because some of them are not only redundant, some of them at the moment could be a long-term trap, because they would imply lower investment in education, lower adoption of advanced technologies, limited technological spillovers, and consequently slow transition from stagnation to growth.
And as you were speaking, one nation that comes to mind, you didn't address in the book, but I'm sure you can comment on, is Singapore, right? A country that doesn't have a lot of natural resources, but invested heavily in education, and today has one of the world's, highest GDP per capita, right? So just to prove your point that investing in education is definitely something to think about. So talking about wealth and inequality, so the little dichotomy is that, Professor, we have some countries that have done well, others have done not so well, and in the book you talk about the lack of convergence in terms of development. So talk a little bit about, why is this happening, this divergence? Why aren't we seeing convergence in terms of development? And what can we do about it?
Right. So when you think about the roots of inequality as we see it today, so naturally we see an enormous inequality across the globe, we see an enormous inequality between nations, and we see an enormous inequality across nations. It is very tempting to say, well, the reason that some countries are more prosperous than others is that they have higher level of education, they have better machinery, and they use more advanced technologies. But this doesn't take us anywhere, because then the question is why some societies fail to invest properly in education, why some societies fail to invest properly in advanced machineries, and why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies. And this suggests to us the deeper forces that were formed in the distant past are conditioning societies in a way that prevents them from taking decisions that are necessarily enhancing the growth process. So as I said before, about 200 years ago, we started to see this enormous takeoff from stagnation to growth. Initially, it occurs in Western Europe, and their offshoots in North America. But other regions of the world, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa, is remaining behind for a prolonged period of time. And since this takeoff is associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita on average, an enormous gap is created between, say, the US and a country in Africa like Kenya. I mean, a gap of about 1 to 60, 1 to 100, depending on how you measure income per capita. And the question is, what is the source of it? And the Journey of Humanity, the manuscript that I wrote, suggests that much of this inequality is based on forces that existed in the distant past. So the second part of my book, after basically resolving the mystery of growth, I'm asking myself, given the inequality today, let me peel different layers of influence that could have affected inequality as we see it today. I start with colonialism. And colonialism naturally is an important force that is generating part of the divergence that we see across the globe. Naturally, the colonialism is associated with extraction. Colonialism is associated with the horrific institutions of slavery and other form of extraction. And this perpetuates inequality more than otherwise. But perhaps even more important in the context of the understanding of the mechanism that I have in mind, colonialism is associated with an uneven trade. Colonialist country, the colonizers are specializing in the production of manufactured goods, human capital intensive goods, education intensive goods, from which there are great externalities. Colonies, on the other hand, are forced to specialize in the production of raw material and agricultural goods. These productions are not requiring education at the same extent. They have limited technological spillovers. And as a result of it, if we think about the wheels of change that I defined before, the ones that propel the transition from stagnation to growth, This specialization in production is expediting the transition from stagnation to growth of countries like England, for instance, but at the same time, delaying the transition from stagnation to growth of a country like India. Why? Because it depresses investment in education, it delays the demographic transition, and consequently, it delays the transition from stagnation to growth. So first, as I said, I explore the role of institutions. But then the question is institutions really the primitive source behind the inequality as we see it across the globe? Is it the origin of it? Not at all, because naturally, some countries are colonizing others based on uneven development before that. And then the question is, why is it the case that some societies, say in the year 1491, are more advanced than other societies? And this leads us into the role of institutions, the role of culture, the role of geography, and the role of human diversity. And I develop an holistic view in which each of these factors is important in the understanding of comparative development as we see it today, is important for the understanding of the inequality that is emerging across the globe.
Yeah, and as I was reading the book, being an engineer with a science background, I'm always trying to see how can theories be transformed into analytical models for programming and simulation. And I was just wondering, as an aside, would be great to see whether one of your grad students could develop an analytical framework where you can actually simulate and see how these forces come to bear and see the outcomes of it, just as an interesting experiment to have a tool that people can use to understand the unified theory of growth. So I want to move to, you've mentioned geography, you mentioned culture, institutions. Those are all very important. We're in the United States having this conversation. This is a Black History Month. And one of the most fascinating chapters in the book is the one where you titled it Out of Africa. I thought it was very fascinating, in which you talk about the role of diversity in development. And, just explain how it all goes all the way back to diversity from the time of the migration of Homo sapiens leaving Africa and coming to different parts of the world. Just talk about how that notion of diversity is in terms of development. And then we can come back and dig a little bit into the difference of the positive aspect of diversity and the negative aspect of diversity. But first of all, just go back to Africa and talk about how diversity played a role.
Right. So this is a very fascinating subject, as you suggested. So about 60 to 90,000 years ago, we see massive migration of Homo sapiens from Africa. This is partly a reflection of population pressure that existed at the time, partly perhaps a reflection of curiosity. And we see gradually that people are migrating gradually out of Africa and start to populate the world. Now, as they migrate in sequential pace. Namely, some individuals are migrating from East Africa and residing, say, in the Fertile Crescent. Others perhaps are migrating into a different direction, but once they're in the Fertile Crescent, they reside there for a long period of time, they start to populate the place, and once they reach a point in which the carrying capacity of the environment is not sufficient to support them, another group of migrants are migrating out of this population and are starting to explore regions in Europe. Others are exploring regions in Australia, in Asia, crossing the Bering Strait into the Americas. So we see this sequential migration that is taking place. Now, when this migration is taking place, naturally, there is a certain degree of diversity that existed in the African population that reflects the fact that Homo sapiens was in Africa for a long period of time, and the population became significantly more diverse over time. Now, when population are departing from the original population, they don't carry with them the entire scope of diversity that existed in the original population. And why is it so? You can think about it as sampling from a limited distribution. The size of the African population is relatively small. The size of the migrants is relatively small. And consequently, the migrant population is not representing fully the spectrum that existed in the original population. As I said, they move, say, to the Fertile Crescent, and they have limited diversity relative to what existed before. Now, when the next group is moving, again, they carry a subset of what existed in the Fertile Crescent. And this implies that the further they migrate from Africa, the lower will be the degree of diversity. So there is a very pronounced relationship between migratory distance from Africa and the degree of diversity across indigenous population on planet Earth. The further people migrated, the lower is the degree of diversity. And why is it so important? So this is where the economics part start to play a role. So when you think about diversity and the impact of diversity on economic development or in economic prosperity, diversity has two conflicting effects on economic prosperity. On the one hand, there is a beneficial effect. Diversity is generating cross-pollination of ideas, cross-fertilization of ideas, complementarities in the production process. And as a result of it, it is conducive for innovations and conducive for productivity. That's the beneficial aspect. And then there is the adverse consequences of diversity. Diversity is typically associated with mistrust, social non-cohesiveness, and civil conflicts. And consequently, at any point in time, diversity has some significant positive implications and some significant adverse consequences, which implies that an intermediate level of diversity, not an extreme level of diversity and not extreme level of homogeneity, is conducive for development, namely a level that will be sufficiently conducive to innovations, but at the same time will maintain social cohesiveness. Now, what we see in the course of human history, which is very interesting, if you look at say, the Middle Ages, it appears that societies in Southeast Asia, like China, Japan, and Korea, have the level of diversity that is conducive for development in the Middle Ages. Now, when we think about these societies today, they do not appear to us as diverse, but nevertheless, this is a time period in which social cohesiveness is much more important than innovativeness, and therefore the degree of diversity of these societies was conducive for development. But as we move into today's world, into the year 2020, it will turn out that diversity, the level of diversity that is conducive for development, is present here in the United States. Society that is incredibly more diverse than the Chinese society or the Japanese society or the Korean society. And why is it the case? We live in a much more demanding technological environment. And the cultural fluidity that exists in the United States permits the society to cope or to navigate this stormy technological environment and to have the upper hand. But at the same time, of course, it comes with some social conflicts, as we see it in the course of human history. But nevertheless, we see that the United States at the moment is the place where these two forces are balancing each other out in a perfect fashion. And if we think about the future, as we move perhaps into even a more rapidly changing technological environment, it implies that more diverse societies will have even further beneficial impact, and consequently societies opt to develop policies, education policies that will foster the degree of diversity in society. So what type of policies could it be? Education policies that first will mitigate the cost of diversity, will teach individuals how to tolerate one another, to respect other ethnic groups, and to respect pluralism. So a lot of what we see in the education system at the moment in the United States is very conducive for this, because it is precisely designed to mitigate the cost of diversity, to generate social cohesiveness so as to benefit from the fantastic implications of diversity for innovations, from the fantastic positive implications of diversity for innovation. So this is one aspect in this policy. But if you take societies that are not like the United States, societies that are at the moment incredibly homogeneous, say take the Chinese society that is relatively homogeneous, then in this type of societies, education policies should foster critical thinking, should foster thinking outside of the box, should foster pluralism in places, in a place where it is missing, so as to increase cross-fertilization of ideas and to increase the potential of diversity for innovations.
You know, there are two areas, and I thought this chapter was so fascinating to read because there are two areas where I think cross-pollination really makes itself felt strong. And one is music and culture. If you think of rock and roll, you talk about it in the book. But then as a lover of cuisine, I thought even food. I think where you see a lot of cross-pollination around food as well, in terms of the positive aspects of looking at diversity and why it's important. But you also talk about, and I think it's very important for policymakers, almost like finding a sort of a gray area between how much homogeneity do you need in a society, how much heterogeneity you need in society. You talk about Sweden in the book, a place I spend a lot of time myself, and the Swedes have a word called lagom, L-A-G-O-M, which basically is not so homogeneous, not so heterogeneous. So that in-between place, how does one measure diversity in a way that will allow us to say one society is more diverse than the other? What's the best recipe or example you would give for how we should talk about measuring diversity?
So it's very complex to measure the diversity. We don't have perfect measures of diversity. The way that we measure diversity in our research and the way that it is reflected in the book is based on basically inferences from the migration out of Africa about the potential diversity in each location in the world, taking into account that in the post-1500 period, people are migrating massively from different places. So for instance, in the context of the United States, migratory distance from the US to Africa is not very relevant because very small fraction of the US population is originated historically in the year 1500 in North America. So you have basically to take into account migration out of Africa of the ancestral population of each society today, and to create a composite measure that will allow you basically to capture this idea. And in fact, the measure exists, and the measure is precisely showing us what is the rank in terms of diversity across societies and how important diversity is for productivity. And it turns out that, as I said, diversity is incredibly important. It explains a significant portion of the inequality across the globe. And by having education policies that can bring you closer to what is ideal for your society, you can generate a tremendous increase in economic prosperity.
Professor Oded, we have about another, Professor Galor, we have another, say 10 minutes to wrap up here, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about, you know, we're here at the Edison Electric Institute. Public policy is extremely important for what we do to make sure we put in place the right policies that will enable greater electrification around the world. So talking to business leaders and policymakers around the world, and they say, look, Lawrence, this idea of a unified growth theory that Professor Galor is talking about, it's it's non-applicable. So talk about how can we use the ideas in this book to help inform public policy in the United States, in the electricity sector, but more broadly around the world, talking about the World Bank, the United Nations. How can all of these organizations and businesses learn, or at least better understand their businesses by understanding the unified growth theory?
So that's a fantastic question, and I'm glad that you asked it. So naturally, part of what is done in the journey of humanity in my book is sort of an intellectual exploration. But the important part is, in fact, an attempt to design policies or to enlighten people about the design of policies that could mitigate inequality across the globe. So this is not, unified growth theory is based on profound mathematical foundations, but nevertheless, it has very concrete policy implications about how can one mitigate inequality across the globe. And what it suggests to us is that unlike the Washington consensus that was prevailing for a while, in which one policy was supposed to be prescribed to all nations and to generate greater equality across the globe, the policy that is being prescribed in the context of the journey of humanity and unified growth theory is country-specific policy, geography-specific policy, culture-specific policy, with the clear idea that one policy does not fit all nations. And let me give you a very simple example. So one of the most important elements in the context of economic development and in the context of economic growth is what we defined as future-oriented mindset, your ability to plan for the future. And it turns out that there are great variations in the degree of future-oriented mindset across the globe. Now remember, future-oriented mindset affects education decisions, saving decisions, life cycle decisions, technological adoption. So those societies that grow more rapidly, those societies that are more prosperous today have greater future-oriented mindset in their population, namely the ability of people to plan for the future. Now, as I explore in the book, and as I explored in an earlier research paper that I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago, future-oriented mindset is formed based on the geographical heritage of each society. And let me explain it very simply. So think about two societies. One society is a society of fishermen, another society is a society of farmers. Now, farmers are induced by nature to cultivate the land. What does it mean? They plant today, they harvest maybe 6 months later, and then they store the seeds for the next year production. So nature is teaching them how to delay gratification. Nature is teaching them how to plan for the future. So if you're residing in a place where the agriculture is conducive for farming, nature is training you in the course of human history over thousands of years to plant, to harvest, to store, and as a result of it, to be future-oriented. But now think about a society of fishermen. You go to fish, there is no planning involved because storage technology is limited, planning is very limited, and as a result of it, nature is not training you to be future-oriented minded. And in fact, when you look at the globe as a whole, it turns out that it's not only the distinction between fishermen and farmers, it's the differences between different farmers, in the sense that if you look at any regions of the world, those places in which the return to agricultural investment is higher due to crops that have higher yield are places where people are more future-oriented because they were engaged in agriculture and nature taught them how to delay gratification. So we see this vast variation in future-oriented mindset across the globe. And we can reshape it. If we understand this, then part of the education curriculum today should be geared towards the education of children, how to be more future-oriented. We don't need to do it in places like China or Japan, where in fact in this agricultural society, nature already trained the societies to be very future-oriented. Look at their saving rates, the education. But we need to do it in other places across the globe by, as I said, teaching children and rewarding children for delaying gratification. This can be done, for instance, by introducing children to musical instruments where over time, you see the reward for investment, and this teaches you how to delay gratification, and how to be future-oriented. So this is one example in which you can look at individual countries across the globe, individual societies, and design differential education policies based on the heritage of these societies. Well, as I said before, in the context of diversity, some societies are more diverse than others. In societies that are very diverse, we would like to see education policies that foster social cohesiveness. In societies that are relatively homogeneous, we would like to see education policies that will foster pluralism, different education policies based on geographical location and its impact on human diversity.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I really want to just go back briefly to the notion of the future-oriented mindset. Given where we are in the book, you talk a little bit about the climate challenges facing the world. I think a lot of it boils down to long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. So, from your experience and the work you've done in terms of your research, the book has been translated into 31 languages, I believe. What has been the reaction you've gotten from different parts of the world in terms of applying this notion of future-oriented mindset? What kind of reactions you've gotten so far?
Right. So in this particular research agenda, in fact, was very influential. And I think that, again, it was not, when it was written in the form of an academic paper, trying to understand the origins of what we call time preference, namely future-oriented mindset, and the geographical origins of it. And this is a very well-respected article that, in fact, affected the mindset of a lot of people in the academic profession. It was only in the context of the book, The Journey of Humanity, that I brought it into the policy realm, in which basically, in the context of saying that much of the inequality today is originated in forces that were formed in the distant past, I pushed this idea that, in fact, education policies can be used in order to foster future-oriented mindset and consequently to mitigate inequality across the globe.
This has been a recurring theme. In fact, last year, over the last 2 years since we've had this Influential Mind series going, we've had multiple authors. We had Roman Sconaris from the UK who talked about a good ancestor. And then we also had Ari Wallach last year who talked about the same thing around, sort of a thinking long-term and putting long-term thinking in the context. Professor Galor, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to congratulate you again on the book. I really enjoyed digging through it. And as you know, I take my readership very seriously when I get a book to read, but I like to end on a different note somewhat. So we're in a different world today compared to when you wrote the book. We have new geopolitical crises facing the world, economic hardships, an array of inequalities facing the world, climate change. And if you were to rewrite the book today, what would you change in terms of some of your hypotheses? And what would you add to sort of help us understand the world today? Not the world 3 years ago when you wrote the book, but the world today with all of these polycrises coming at us.
Right. So first, the book was released very recently, and in this respect, it reflects sort of my state of knowledge and sort of the state of the world quite recently. But there is one momentous event that occurred while I was drafting the book that is not really integrated well into the book, which is COVID-19. And the importance of COVID-19 is the understanding that when COVID-19 hit humanity, there was a clear period of dismal perception of the future of humanity. People talk about the fact that humanity will never be the same. Human interaction will never be the same. This is a shock that will affect humanity and will derail to a large extent our march forward. And if I would write a book in the aftermath of COVID-19, then in fact, I would reflect more on the insights from the journey of humanity about the fact that the march of humanity to a large extent was a relentless march, and human ingenuity was always there to rescue us from different crises. whether in the eve of the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago, where in fact the population was on the brink of mass extinction and agriculture was discovered, generating enormous amount of resources and permitting an explosion of the world population, whether it is in the aftermath of the Black Death, where 40% of the European population was decimated, but ultimately, again, human recovered with great resolve. Or if we think about the atrocities of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, or events like the Great Depression and the Spanish flu, each of them at the time appeared as an incredible catastrophe that is about to derail humanity entirely for a long period of time. But ultimately, when you look at it with perspective of decades, centuries, millennia, it appears that the journey of humanity is quite relentless and no event derailed the journey of humanity from its course. Each of this event was devastating for the population that lived during this period, but humanity as a whole was not affected by it. And you can see it quite clearly in the context of COVID-19. mRNA technologies were advanced, and here we are, we communicate precisely as we communicated 3 years ago, and all the dismal predictions about the future of humanity are behind us. Naturally, so in this respect, this is the only change that I would have introduced into the book. The book is referring to climate change as an incredible challenge that is looming in the horizon, but again, is projecting my optimism about the ability of humanity to overcome this crisis as well, provided that we will not be complacent, provided that we will adopt environmentally friendly technologies, provided that we will adopt strict environmental standards, and provided that we will provide scientists with the proper incentives to innovate and to develop technologies that will ultimately make this crisis into a fading memory, perhaps a century from now.
Well, look, I must say that this is a very highly recommended book. We started this series for this year a few weeks ago when we sat down and had a conversation with Dr. Richard Haas. In his book, he talked about the Bill of Obligations, and I would dare to say that understanding the past, understanding the journey of humanity through the lens in which you've provided us through this book should be something that I think everyone should make their obligation, because understanding the past, how we got to where we are, I think is going to be key to understand how we go forward. So, Professor Galor, thank you so much for taking the time to joining us. I did commit to you that I will come and visit you at Brown University at some point and have a cup of coffee and learn more about your theory. So
I will be delighted. Let me just add one more sentence before we conclude, just for the audience as a whole. This is not an academic book. This is a book that is highly accessible. It was written in a way that is jargon-free. You don't need to be an economist. You don't need to be a mathematician. You need to be a biologist. It is accessible to any educated individual across the globe, any curious individual across the globe. And we just touched the surface in this discussion. And you can, I think that if you will take the book, I think that you will concur with the views that you heard here.
And the book is, like I said, translated into how many languages? 30 plus languages already?
31 languages.
31 languages. So you have no excuse. If your English is not too good, you can read it in Swedish or German or Spanish or Chinese, whichever one. So thank you so much, Professor Galor, and thank you for joining us. This is Lawrence Jones with EEI International Program, Influential Minds. Our guest has been Professor Oded Galor of Brown University and the author of Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Thank you, Professor Galor.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.